He waited nearly 30 years to die, and when the moment finally came, he didn't beg, didn't apologize, and didn't break down. Instead, he thanked the state for killing him, and calmly began reciting a poem as the drugs entered his body. But that final moment barely scratches the surface of how Edward Zakruski got there. Because long before death row, before the trials and appeals, he was something else entirely. A trusted Air Force sergeant, a husband, a father of two. And what happened inside his home one quiet summer evening in Florida would leave investigators, jurors, and the public asking the same question for decades. How does someone cross a line they can never come back from? On the outside, Edward Zakruski looked like the definition of stability. He was 29 years old, a technical sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, married, raising two young children, and living in what most people would call a quiet, normal Florida neighborhood. To neighbors and coworkers, he was disciplined, reliable, and soft-spoken. The kind of man you wouldn't think twice about trusting. But inside that house, things had been unraveling for months. His marriage to Sylvia was strained, arguments were becoming more frequent, and the tension was impossible to hide. What most people didn't know was that Edward had already started voicing dark thoughts. More than once, he told a neighbor that if Sylvia ever tried to leave him, he wouldn't let it happen. He said he'd kill them all first. At the time, those words were brushed off as anger talking, a stressed man venting. No one believed he was serious. And that was the mistake. Because behind the calm exterior, Edward wasn't losing control. He was holding it together, just long enough for one moment to push everything over the edge. That moment came on the morning of June 9th, 1994. Edward was already at work on the Air Force Base when his phone rang. On the other end of the line was his 7-year-old son, Kim. In a small, uncertain voice, the boy told his father that Sylvia wanted a divorce, and that she planned to take the kids with her. Edward didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or rush home in a panic. He listened, said very little, and hung up. Then he did something that still chills people to this day. During his lunch break, he calmly left the base, drove to a hardware store, and bought a machete. After that, he went right back to work. He clocked in, finished his shift, and spoke to coworkers like nothing had changed. No one noticed anything off. No one had any idea that while they were wrapping up an ordinary workday, Edward had already decided how the night would end. And by the time the sun started to set, he wasn't reacting anymore. He was preparing. Edward made sure he got home first that evening. He moved through the house quietly, deliberately, like someone following a checklist. In the bathroom, he hid the machete. Nearby, he placed a crowbar and a rope where he could reach them without thinking. Then he waited. When 34-year-old Sylvia walked through the front door, she had no idea anything was wrong. She was tired, ready to sit down and rest. She settled into the living room, unaware that Edward was already standing behind her. Without a word, he lifted the crowbar and brought it down. Then again. The blows knocked her unconscious, but she was still breathing. Edward didn't stop. He dragged her into the bedroom, wrapped the rope around her neck, and finished what he had started. There was no struggle left, no noise to draw attention, just silence. And once it was over, Edward didn't leave the house. He didn't hesitate. Instead, he walked calmly toward the bathroom and called out to his son by name. 7-year-old Kim came into the bathroom the same way he always did. To him, it was just another normal night. His dad had called him to brush his teeth, nothing more. He stepped inside without fear, without hesitation. But the moment he looked up, he knew something was wrong. Edward raised the machete. Kim saw it coming and instinctively threw his arm up to protect himself. The blade sliced deep into his wrist, but it didn't stop the attack. Edward swung again and again, striking his son across the head, the neck, the back. There was no chance to escape. Within moments, Kim collapsed onto the bathroom floor, dying just feet from the sink. But Edward still wasn't finished. He called out again, using the same calm, familiar tone. This time, it was for his daughter. 5-year-old Anna walked in, trusting the only person she believed would never hurt her. She tried to defend herself, too. Cuts were later found on her hand and elbow, signs she fought back. But there was nowhere to run. The machete fell repeatedly until her small body dropped beside her brother's. And when the bathroom fell quiet, Edward did one last thing that erased any doubt about what he had done. Edward went back to the bedroom and dragged Sylvia's body into the bathroom, laying her beside her children. He stared at her for a moment, unsure if she was truly gone. Then he picked up the machete and struck one final time. Only then did he stop. There was no panic, no frantic cleanup. Edward walked out the front door, got into his car, and drove away like it was any other night. He headed to Orlando, boarded a flight, and vanished. By the time anyone realized what had happened inside that house, he was already thousands of miles away. Edward resurfaced in Hawaii under a new name, Michael Green. He joined a secluded religious commune, lived in a small shack, and worked in exchange for food and shelter. To the people around him, he was quiet, helpful, forgettable. He blended in so well it was like he had always been there. But back in Florida, the silence he left behind didn't last. When Edward stopped showing up for work, the Air Force marked him absent without leave. Deputies were sent to the house for a welfare check. What they found inside turned a missing person case into a nationwide manhunt. And for 4 months, it seemed like Edward had gotten away with everything, until one television broadcast changed it all. On October 15th, 1994, Edward's face appeared on national television. An episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired his photo, naming him as a wanted man in the murders of his wife and children. And almost instantly, the life he'd built under a fake name began to collapse. The family on the commune recognized him the moment they saw the broadcast. The preacher confronted him quietly and said the words Edward knew were coming. "That looks a lot like you." Edward didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He walked back to his shack, packed his things, and left behind a single note that read, "I'm sorry." 9 days later, Edward walked into a police station and turned himself in. Back in Florida, the questions everyone wanted answered still hung in the air. Why did he do it? What had driven a military father to wipe out his own family? As investigators dug into his past, a much longer story began to surface. One that stretched back years before that June night and painted a picture far more complicated than it first appeared. Edward's past started in Kalamazoo, Michigan, but his adult life was shaped by the Air Force. By the mid-1980s, he had worked his way up to technical sergeant. While stationed in Montana, he met a young South Korean woman named In Poon. When she became pregnant, they married, and she took the American name Sylvia. Together, they built what looked like a stable military family. But that image didn't survive overseas. In 1989, Edward was transferred to South Korea, and the family followed. For Sylvia, the move was brutal. As a South Korean woman married to an American and raising mixed-race children, she faced open judgment and discrimination. The stress followed them home, and the marriage began to fracture. Arguments became common, resentment grew, and whatever trust remained slowly disappeared. When Edward's tour ended in 1992, they relocated to Okaloosa County, Florida. But a new home didn't fix what was already broken. By the summer of 1994, Sylvia had made up her mind. She wanted a divorce, and she planned to take the children back to South Korea with her. What she didn't know was that Edward had already convinced himself of something terrifying, that letting them leave was worse than what he was about to do. 10 days after turning himself in, Edward was extradited back to Florida and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Less than a year later, even from behind bars, he tried to run again. In August 1995, Edward and another inmate attempted to escape the Okaloosa County Jail, making it as far as the outer fence before guards shut it down. It was one last failed attempt to avoid what was coming. By March 1996, Edward stopped fighting the charges and confessed to all 3 murders in open court. From that point on, the trial wasn't about guilt. It was about punishment. Prosecutors described the killings as calculated and cruel, focusing on the terror the children must have felt in their final moments. They argued that this wasn't a loss of control, but a planned execution. The defense told a very different story. They claimed Edward was mentally and emotionally broken, pushed past his limit by fear of losing his children. His attorney argued that Edward believed he was sparing them from a future of pain. the same rejection their mother had faced in Korea. Not rage, they said, but a twisted sense of mercy. The jury couldn't fully agree. They voted for death in Sylvia's case. They voted for death in Kim's case. But when it came to Anna, the decision split down the middle. 6 jurors said death. 6 said life. For a brief moment, it looked like that tie might matter. That tie didn't save him. The judge stepped in and overrode the jury, sentencing Edward to death for Anna's murder as well. In a single ruling, he received 3 death sentences and no chance at mercy. The court said Anna likely understood what was happening, that her final moments were filled with fear. And in the judge's words, there was no more atrocious way to die. Edward spent the next 29 years sitting on Florida's death row as appeal after appeal failed. Even when state laws changed and other death sentences were overturned, his remained untouched. Time moved on. The case faded from headlines, but the ending never changed. On July 31, 2025, Edward Zakruski was executed by lethal injection. His final meal was heavy and deliberate. His final words were calm, almost clinical. He thanked the state for killing him efficiently and began quoting a poem about promises yet to be kept. Minutes later, he was gone. 3 lives were taken in a matter of moments. 1 life ended nearly 3 decades later. And when it was finally over, the question still lingered. Was this justice? Or was it simply the final chapter in a story where no ending could ever feel right?